Welcome to episode 50 of Fresh Thinking by Snowden Optiro. My name is Anthony Cook, Product Manager for Supervisor at Snowden Optiro. Today I'm joined by Oscar Rondon, who's our Principal Geostatistician. Oscar has a PhD in mathematics and an extensive career in geostatistics, providing global services in both training and consulting. This makes him the perfect guest, as our topic for the podcast today is the closure problem, greater than the sum of its parts. Glad to have you here, Oscar.
Thanks, Anthony. I'm pleased to talking to you about this interesting topic.
Oscar, the closure problem is not unique to geosciences, but it can have significant impact in many of the processes we carry out. Can you give a brief overview on what the closure problem is?
Yeah, sure, Anthony. The closure problem is something that is particular to a type of data that we call compositional data set or compositional data. In short, the compositional data needs, let's say, three main ingredients, right? So it needs to be multivariate first. Each attribute should have a value and a location in space. It needs to be positive. All attributes in this data should be positive, and the total sum of each entry in the data set needs to be constant. And that's what we know as the closure. It seems pretty simple, right? The constraint of having the total sum equal to a constant, but it can have really a big impact on the way we analyze compositional data set. For instance, the traditional interpretation of the linear regression is no longer possible in compositional data set. It's also important to recognize that traditional information that we get in kriging, for instance, the covariance and variance matrix is what we call in mathematics not invertible or singular. And that in plain English means that we cannot use traditional geostatistical techniques with compositional data set. We need specific techniques for compositional data.
Thanks, Oscar. That's a great explanation. So what problems could arise in geostats if we don't account for closure?
Look, not accounting for the closure is certainly a fatal flaw, Anthony. If we have compositional data set, we need to account for the closure because there are relationships and dependencies that need to be taken into account. Imagine, for instance, that we have a channel iron ore deposit, right? And we have iron, silica, and alumina grades, and the total sum is greater than 100. It doesn't make any sense at all.
So, Oscar, if it's such a big problem, why don't we see it discussed more in our common processes, such as a Krieged resource estimate?
Look, Anthony, the treatment of compositional data set has been around for a long time. If I remember well, or if I recall, since 1980. The problem is that practitioners in mining or in geostatistics didn't pay attention to these developments, but some of them were there. The other issue was the lack of commercial software where we can use all these geostatistical techniques applied to compositional data set. And I guess another issue is that you can run your estimate, for instance, for gold or copper, without using compositional data. So it's very specific to some problems where you have compositional data set. In some cases, for instance, in some iron ore problems, you can run independent estimations without using any compositional data set and try to maintain that total sum equal to 100. In reality, if you have a compositional data set, we need to acknowledge that and use the right techniques.
Absolutely. So how can we overcome the closure problem?
Yeah, look, the easiest answer to that is we need to use the right compositional techniques, right? So, or techniques for compositional data set. My advice is that first, we need to check that what we have is a compositional data, right? If the data is compositional, then we need to use compositional data sets and work and solve the closure problem, or take that into account. Look, Anthony, for instance, if we are running a multivariate simulation of compositional data set, it's a must to take into account the closure using the right compositional transformation. If I recall well, you got some issues with a project you were running where I suggested to use the ALR transformation to deal with the closure problem.
Yeah, that's right. It was an iron ore project, and even though in that case I fine-tuned all the parameters as best that I could, I was just getting artifacts in the final result. And ultimately, I wasn't happy with the model validation, and it really came down to the closure problem. So that's when we used the additive log ratio transformation. It's one of the log ratio compositional transformation techniques that you suggested. And applying this transformation before the multivariate transformation really produced that better model. Again, because it accounted for that closure problem that we had.
Oh, that's great, Anthony. Can you comment on the tools you use for that project, please?
It was tricky. At the time, I was using Supervisor for the individual Gaussian simulations and a whole lot of R code to do the file handling and various transformations. So I had to find the libraries and then implement them. It was a bit of a chore to set up. Thankfully, I was able to automate those processes. And since then, we've brought them into Supervisor as well. So I don't need to worry about it anymore. I do believe that there are some Python libraries. I didn't use them personally, but those tools are out there and they are freely available to use if you do know the language.
Yep, great.
Do you have any other comments or recommendations for our listeners when it comes to the closure problem?
Yeah, sure, Anthony. Look, ensure the closure problem is real, and practitioners must not ignore that problem. Okay, so there is a good literature out there about compositional data, brand new results, and I strongly recommend to read the book by Uta Muller and Raymond Tolasana about compositional data set. And there is also available free software in R that you can use to run compositional data analysis.
And we'll put those details in the notes for the podcast.
Sure. Yeah.
So that draws this podcast to a close. Oscar, thank you for joining us on Fresh Thinking and for participating in this technical discussion.
Thank you for having me, Anthony.
Your inputs are well valued.
Thank you.
And if you'd like to listen to more of our Fresh Thinking by Snowden Optiro, you will find them for free on our website, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and most other podcast platforms. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.